The morning sun blazed over the Arizona desert as Jake Morrison guided his horse through the rocky canyon. Sweat dripped from his weathered face and dust covered his worn leather chaps. He had been riding for 3 days straight, searching for his stolen cattle. The trail had gone cold near Apache territory, and Jake knew he was taking a dangerous risk by continuing alone. Jake was not like other cowboys who worked the ranches in these parts. While most men his age had settled down or moved to easier work in town, Jake lived for the open range. At 32, he was still as tough as rawhide and twice as stubborn. His reputation for tracking stolen livestock was known throughout 3 counties, but his stubborn nature had cost him friends and relationships over the years. The canyon walls rose high on both sides, creating deep shadows even in the morning light. Jake's horse, a reliable paint named Thunder, picked his way carefully over loose rocks and around thorny brush. The silence was broken only by the sound of hooves on stone and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. As Jake rounded a bend, he spotted something that made him pull Thunder to a stop. Smoke was rising from behind a cluster of red rocks ahead. Someone had made camp, and in this remote area, that could mean trouble. Jake dismounted quietly and tied Thunder to a sturdy mesquite bush. He checked his rifle and moved forward on foot, staying low and using the rocks for cover. What he saw made him pause. A young Apache woman knelt beside a small fire, grinding corn on a flat stone. She wore a simple buckskin dress decorated with colorful beads, and her long black hair was braided with strips of leather. Jake had seen Apache women before, but always from a distance. This one was different somehow. She moved with quiet grace, and there was something peaceful about the way she worked. The woman's name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her language. She was the daughter of a respected Apache medicine man, and she possessed skills that few people knew about. Ayanna could track animals through the harshest terrain, find water in the desert, and identify every plant that could heal or harm. She was also one of the few Apache who spoke English well, having learned it from a missionary who had lived with her tribe for several years. Ayanna had left her village 2 days earlier to gather special herbs that grew only in this canyon. Her father needed them to make medicine for a sick child, and the herbs had to be picked at exactly the right time to be effective. She had planned to return home the same day, but a sudden storm had forced her to take shelter in the canyon overnight. Jake watched from behind a boulder as Ayanna finished grinding the corn and began packing her supplies. He noticed that she moved carefully, checking the ground before each step. This was smart behavior in snake country. The desert was home to several species of venomous snakes, including diamondback rattlers and coral snakes. Even experienced outdoorsmen had to be constantly alert. As Jake debated whether to approach or leave quietly, his decision was made for him. Thunder whinnied loudly from his hiding spot, and Ayanna's head snapped up. Her dark eyes scanned the rocks until they found Jake crouched behind the boulder. For a moment, neither of them moved. "I can see you, cowboy," Ayanna called out in clear English. "Come out where I can see all of you." Jake stood slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. He had dealt with Apache before, and he knew that any sudden movement could be his last. "I mean no harm," he called back. "Just passing through." Ayanna studied him carefully. She had heard stories about cowboys who stole Apache horses and cattle, but this man didn't look like a thief. His clothes were worn but clean, and his horse looked well cared for. Still, she remained cautious. "You are far from the cattle trails," she observed. "What brings you to this place?" Jake walked closer, moving slowly. "Looking for stolen cattle. Trail led this way." He stopped about 20 feet from her fire. "You haven't seen any cattle passing through, have you?" Ayanna shook her head. "No cattle. Only you and your horse." She paused, then asked, "Who stole them?" "Don't know for sure. Happened 3 nights ago. Took about 40 head from the Double R Ranch. Jake gestured toward the north. Trail showed at least 4 horses, maybe more. The mention of stolen cattle interested Ayanna more than Jake realized. Her tribe had been blamed for cattle theft many times, usually without proof. Often it was Mexican bandits, or even dishonest ranchers who stole cattle and let the Apache take the blame. This always led to trouble for her people. "Mexican bandits came through yesterday," Ayanna said after thinking for a moment. 4 men with many cattle. They were heading toward the border. Jake felt a surge of hope. This was the first real information he had gotten about his stolen herd. "Which way did they go?" Ayanna pointed southeast toward a narrow gap between 2 tall rock formations. "Through Devil's Pass, but it is dangerous to follow alone. The pass is narrow, and there are places where men can hide and shoot." "I've been in worse places," Jake said, but he appreciated the warning. "Thank you for the information." As Jake turned to leave, Ayanna called out to him. "Wait, you should know something else. Those men, they were not just stealing cattle. They were scouting, looking at the land, drawing pictures on paper. I think they plan to come back with more men." This news troubled Jake. If bandits were planning a larger operation in the area, it could mean big trouble for all the ranchers. The local sheriff was 2 days' ride away, and the army fort was even further. The ranchers would have to defend themselves. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake asked. Ayanna was quiet for a moment. "Because when cattle are stolen, my people are always blamed first, even when we had nothing to do with it. I do not want more trouble to come to my tribe." Jake nodded, understanding. He had heard stories of Apache being punished for crimes they didn't commit. It wasn't fair, but it was the way things were in this part of the country. "I'll make sure people know it wasn't Apache who took the cattle." "Words are like wind," Ayanna replied. "They blow away quickly. Proof lasts longer." Jake realized she was right. Even if he told people that Mexican bandits had stolen the cattle, some folks would still blame the Apache. He would need solid proof to clear them completely. "What kind of proof?" he asked. Ayanna walked over to a flat area near some rocks and began drawing in the dirt with a stick. "The bandits left things behind at their camp, things that show they are Mexican, not Apache." She looked up at Jake. "But the camp is in a dangerous place. Much rockfall and snakes everywhere." Jake studied the rough map she had drawn. The bandit camp was located in a side canyon about 2 miles from where they stood. According to Ayanna's drawing, the only way in was through a narrow passage that could easily become a trap if someone was waiting above. "You've been there?" Jake asked. "I followed them yesterday, stayed hidden and watched." Ayanna stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. They were careless. Left bottles, tobacco, silver coins, things that prove they are not Apache. Jake was impressed by her tracking skills and her courage. Following armed bandits alone took real guts, even for someone who knew the country well. "Why didn't you take the proof yourself?" A lone Apache woman showing up with proof would not be believed. But a cowboy who found it himself, that would be different. Jake had to admit she was right. In a world where Apache were automatically suspected of any crime, her word alone wouldn't carry much weight. But if he found the evidence himself, people would listen. "I'll need help finding this camp," Jake said. "The country around here all looks the same to me." Ayanna considered this. Helping a white cowboy went against everything her people had taught her about staying away from outsiders. But she also knew that if the Apache were blamed for the cattle theft, there could be serious consequences for her tribe. White men might come seeking revenge, or the army might decide to move the Apache to a worse reservation. "I will show you the way," she said finally. "But we must be very careful. The bandits may have left men behind to watch for anyone following them." Jake agreed, and they began making preparations for the journey to the bandit camp. Ayanna packed her few belongings while Jake went to get Thunder. As he untied his horse, he couldn't help but wonder if he was making a mistake by trusting an Apache woman he had just met. But something about Ayanna impressed him. She was clearly intelligent, skilled, and honest. In his experience, those qualities were rare in anyone, regardless of their race. And she was taking a risk by helping him, just as he was taking a risk by accepting her help. When Jake returned with Thunder, Ayanna had shouldered a small leather bag and was ready to travel. "We should go now," she said. "The day will be hot soon, and we need to reach the camp while there is still shade." They set out together, Ayanna walking ahead and Jake leading Thunder behind her. The Apache woman moved through the desert with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire life in this harsh country. She avoided loose rocks that might cause noise, stepped around cactus patches that Jake hadn't even noticed, and chose paths that provided the best cover. As they traveled, Jake found himself studying Ayanna's movements. She was teaching him things without saying a word. The way she tested the ground before putting her full weight on each step. How she used hand signals to warn him about obstacles ahead. The way she constantly scanned the area around them for signs of danger. After about an hour of walking, Ayanna held up her hand for Jake to stop. She pointed to a spot ahead where the ground was disturbed. Someone had dug a small hole, probably to bury something. Around the hole were the tracks of several horses and boot prints that didn't match Apache moccasins. "This is where they camped the first night," Ayanna whispered. "They buried something here." Jake tied Thunder to a nearby bush and joined Ayanna at the disturbed ground. Together they used their hands and a flat rock to dig up whatever the bandits had buried. What they found confirmed Ayanna's story about the thieves. Buried in the shallow hole was a leather bag containing silver Mexican coins, several bottles that had held tequila, and tobacco wrapped in paper printed with Spanish words. There was also a letter written in Spanish, which neither Jake nor Ayanna could read, but the handwriting was clearly not Apache. "This is good proof," Jake said, placing the items back in the leather bag. "But we need to get this to the sheriff." "First, we must get the cattle back," Ayanna reminded him. "The bandits may sell them in Mexico, and then they will be lost forever." Jake knew she was right. Even with proof that Mexicans had stolen the cattle, the ranchers would still lose their livestock if it crossed the border, and 40 head of cattle represented a lot of money that the Double R Ranch couldn't afford to lose. "How far is it to Devil's Pass?" Jake asked. Ayanna looked at the sun, which was climbing higher in the sky. "Half a day if we move quickly, but we must be very careful. The pass is narrow, and if the bandits have men watching, we could be trapped." They continued their journey, with Ayanna leading the way through increasingly rugged terrain. The land here was broken up by deep ravines, towering rock formations, and patches of thorny desert plants that could tear clothing and skin. Jake was grateful for Ayanna's knowledge of the country, because he would have been lost within an hour on his own. As they climbed higher into the rocky hills, Jake began to understand why this area was called Devil's Pass. The rocks here were dark red and black, twisted into strange shapes by millions of years of wind and weather. Some formations looked like giant claws reaching toward the sky, while others resembled sleeping monsters. The silence in this place was different from the normal quiet of the desert. It was deeper, more complete, as if the rocks themselves were holding their breath. Even Thunder seemed nervous, stepping carefully and keeping his ears constantly moving to catch any sound. "We are close now," Ayanna whispered, as they approached a narrow gap between two massive rock walls. "The pass begins just ahead." Jake could see why this would be a perfect place for an ambush. The gap was barely wide enough for a horse and rider to pass through, and the walls rose straight up on both sides for over 100 feet. Anyone hiding on top of the rocks would have a clear shot at anyone trying to pass below. How do we know if someone's watching? Jake asked. Ayanna smiled slightly, the first time Jake had seen her show any emotion other than caution. We don't go through. We go over. She led him to a place where the rock wall was broken by a series of natural ledges and handholds. It would be a difficult climb, but not impossible for someone in good shape. Jake looked up at the steep rock face and then at Ayanna. You've climbed this before? Many times. Apache children learn to climb before they learn to ride. She began removing items from her pack, keeping only the essentials. We leave everything else here. Come back for it later. Jake secured Thunder in a sheltered spot behind some large boulders and took only his rifle, ammunition, and a canteen of water. The climb would be dangerous enough without extra weight. Ayanna started up the rock face first, moving with the sure-footed grace of someone who had been climbing these rocks since childhood. Jake followed, trying to copy her movements and place his hands and feet in the same spots she used. The climb was harder than it looked. The rock was hot from the sun, and some of the handholds were barely big enough for fingertips. Twice, Jake felt his boots slip on the smooth stone, and he had to press himself against the rock wall to keep from falling. But eventually they reached the top of the pass. From this high vantage point, Jake could see for miles in every direction. To the south, he spotted what he was looking for, a dust cloud that could only mean moving cattle. There, Ayanna pointed toward the dust cloud. Your cattle. Jake pulled out a small telescope he always carried and studied the distant herd. Even at this distance, he could make out the shapes of cattle and several mounted men driving them toward the Mexican border. How far? He asked. 2, maybe 3 hours if they keep moving slow. Ayanna studied the terrain between their position and the distant cattle. But there is a problem. Jake lowered his telescope and looked at her. What kind of problem? Between here and there is Snake Valley. It is called that for good reason. During the day, the snakes come out to warm themselves on the rocks. Very dangerous to cross on foot. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had dealt with rattlesnakes before, but never in large numbers, and Ayanna was talking about crossing an entire valley filled with them. Is there another way around? He asked. Ayanna shook her head. Not if we want to catch the cattle before they reach Mexico. Going around would add a full day to the journey. Jake studied the valley below through his telescope. Even from this height, he could see dark shapes moving on the sun-warmed rocks. Snakes, just as Ayanna had said. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. How do the Apache cross snake country? Jake asked. Very carefully, Ayanna replied, and with the right protection. She opened her small pack and pulled out several items Jake didn't recognize. There were dried plants, a small leather pouch filled with powder, and strips of cloth that had been soaked in some kind of oil. Snake medicine, Ayanna explained. The powder keeps snakes away if you spread it around your sleeping area. The oil on these cloths makes snakes avoid you if you tie them around your boots and wrists. Jake had never heard of such things, but he was willing to try anything that might help them cross the dangerous valley safely. Does it really work? My grandfather crossed Snake Valley many times using these medicines. He lived to be 93 years old and was never bitten by a snake. Ayanna began tying the oil-soaked cloths around her own moccasins. But we must still be very careful. The medicine helps, but it is not magic. As Jake tied the protective cloths around his boots, he found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just one day. This morning, he had been a lone cowboy tracking stolen cattle. Now he was preparing to cross a snake-filled valley with an Apache woman who seemed to know more about survival in this country than he had learned in 20 years. Ready? Ayanna asked, shouldering her pack. Jake checked his rifle and adjusted his hat. As ready as I'll ever be. They began the descent into Snake Valley, moving slowly and testing each step before putting their full weight down. The sun was reaching its peak now, and Jake could feel the heat radiating up from the rocks below. Perfect conditions for snakes to be active and dangerous. As they made their way down the steep hillside, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much more dangerous than he had bargained for. But there was no turning back now. His cattle were getting closer to the Mexican border with each passing minute. And this Apache woman was his only hope of getting them back. What Jake didn't know was that Snake Valley held more dangers than just venomous snakes. The Mexican bandits had left more than just proof of their crime behind them. They had also left traps and surprises that would test both Jake's courage and Ayana's wilderness skills to their very limits. And somewhere in the rocks ahead, a deadly encounter was waiting that would change both their lives forever. The first snake Jake encountered was a small diamondback rattler sunning itself on a flat rock near the bottom of the hill. The serpent's distinctive rattle buzzed a warning as they approached, but it slithered away when it caught the scent of Ayana's protective oils. Jake felt a small surge of hope. Maybe the Apache medicine really did work. "Stay close behind me," Ayana whispered. "Step only where I step, and move slowly. Sudden movements make snakes strike." They began crossing the valley floor, which was littered with rocks, fallen logs, and patches of thorny brush. The heat was intense now, creating shimmering waves that made distant objects dance and blur. Jake's shirt was already soaked with sweat, and they had barely started their journey across the dangerous terrain. Ayana moved with incredible patience, testing each step and scanning the ground ahead before advancing. She used a long stick to probe areas where snakes might be hiding, and twice she motioned for Jake to change direction when she spotted serpents coiled in the shade of rocks. "How do you see them so easily?" Jake asked in a low voice. "Practice," Ayana replied. "My father taught me to hunt snakes when I was young. You learn to see the patterns, the way they coil, the places they like to rest." As they continued across the valley, Jake began to understand what she meant. Once his eyes adjusted to looking for the right things, he started noticing snakes everywhere. A coral snake's bright bands caught his attention near a cluster of prickly pear cactus. The thick body of a cottonmouth was visible beneath a fallen log, and everywhere the distinctive diamond patterns of rattlesnakes decorated rocks and patches of sand. "There are so many," Jake muttered. "This is their season," Ayana explained. "The weather is warm but not too hot, perfect for hunting mice and lizards." She paused to let a large sidewinder pass in front of them. "In another month, when it gets very hot, they will hide underground during the day." The slow pace was frustrating for Jake, who was used to covering ground quickly on horseback. Every minute they spent carefully crossing the snake-filled valley was another minute the bandits had to get his cattle closer to Mexico, but he forced himself to be patient. One bite from a venomous snake would end his chase permanently. About halfway across the valley, they came to a dry creek bed that cut across their path. The creek was about 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep, with steep banks on both sides. During the rainy season, it probably carried rushing water, but now it was just a rocky ditch filled with shadows and hiding places. "We must cross here," Ayana said, studying the creek bed carefully. "But this is the most dangerous part. Snakes like these cool, shaded places." Jake peered down into the creek bed and immediately saw what she meant. The shadows made it almost impossible to tell rocks from coiled snakes, and the steep banks would make it difficult to climb out quickly if they encountered trouble. "Maybe we should go around," Jake suggested. Ayana shook her head. "The creek bed goes for miles in both directions. We would lose too much time." She began removing another item from her pack. "We need different medicine for this." The new item was a small clay pot filled with a thick, dark paste that smelled like burned herbs and animal fat. Ayanna dipped her fingers into the paste and began rubbing it on her exposed skin. "Snake repellent," she explained, "much stronger than the oils, but it only lasts for a short time. And the smell is bad." Jake wrinkled his nose as the pungent odor reached him. The paste smelled like a mixture of skunk spray and rotted fish, but if it would keep venomous snakes away, he was willing to endure the stench. Ayanna helped him apply the paste to his hands, neck, and face. The stuff felt greasy and warm on his skin, and the smell was so strong it made his eyes water. But almost immediately, Jake noticed that the few snakes visible near the creek bed seemed to be moving away from them. "Now we go quickly," Ayanna said. "The paste works, but not for long." They scrambled down into the creek bed and began picking their way across the rocky bottom. The shadows made every step treacherous, and Jake found himself jumping at every dark shape that might be a snake. Twice his boots crunched on shed snake skins, which made him realize just how many serpents use this creek as their home. Halfway across the creek bed, disaster struck. Jake stepped on what he thought was a flat rock, but it shifted under his weight. As he struggled to keep his balance, his hand shot out to grab the creek bank for support. His fingers closed around what felt like a thick rope, but the rope moved. "Snake!" Jake yelled, jerking his hand back. But it was too late. The massive timber rattlesnake he had grabbed was already coiling to strike. Jake could see the serpent's triangular head pulling back, its mouth opening to reveal curved fangs dripping with venom. The snake was easily 6 feet long and as thick as Jake's arm. Time seemed to slow down as Jake watched the deadly snake prepare to strike. He was off balance, half fallen against the creek bank, with nowhere to run. The snake was less than 3 feet away, well within striking distance. In another second, those venomous fangs would sink deep into his flesh. That's when Ayanna moved with speed that seemed impossible. She had been several feet behind Jake, but suddenly she was beside him, a long knife flashing in her hand. The blade caught the timber rattler just behind its head, pinning it to the ground before it could complete its strike. "Don't move!" Ayanna commanded sharply. Jake froze, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The giant rattlesnake writhed violently, its thick body thrashing against the knife that held its head pinned to the earth. Its rattle buzzed like an angry wasp, and Jake could see the venom still dripping from its extended fangs. With her free hand, Ayanna pulled out another knife and made a quick, precise cut. The snake's head separated from its body, ending its struggles instantly. But even in death, the serpent's body continued to coil and twitch for several minutes. "Are you hurt?" Ayanna asked, finally looking at Jake. Jake examined his hands and arms carefully. His shirt sleeve was torn where the snake's body had brushed against him, but he couldn't find any puncture wounds. The Apache woman's quick action had saved his life. "I think I'm okay," Jake said, his voice shaky. "That was too close." "Much too close," Ayanna agreed. "We must be more careful." She cleaned her knives on a patch of sand and slid them back into their sheaths. "The repellent paste is getting weak. We need to move faster now." They climbed out of the creek bed and continued across the valley, both of them more alert than before. Jake's close call with the timber rattler had reminded them both how deadly this country could be. One moment of carelessness could mean the difference between life and death. As they walked, Jake found himself studying Ayanna with new respect. Her quick thinking and faster reflexes had saved his life. Most men he knew wouldn't have been able to react that quickly to a striking snake, but she had moved like lightning. "Where did you learn to fight snakes like that?" Jake asked. "My grandfather was a snake hunter," Ayanna explained. "He taught me that snakes are not evil, just dangerous, like fire or flood water. If you understand them, you can live with them safely." "That was the biggest rattler I've ever seen," Jake said. Timber rattlesnakes grow very large in this valley. Plenty of food and good places to hide. Ayanna paused to scan the terrain ahead. But they are not the most dangerous snakes here. Jake didn't like the sound of that. What's more dangerous than a 6-foot rattlesnake? Coral snakes, Ayanna replied. Much smaller, but their venom is worse. Rattlesnake bite might kill you in hours. Coral snake bite kills in minutes. This information didn't make Jake feel any better about their situation. They still had half the valley to cross, the protective paste was wearing off, and now he knew there were even deadlier snakes ahead. But their luck seemed to improve as they reached the far side of Snake Valley. The terrain became rockier and more open, with fewer hiding places for serpents. Jake could see the dust cloud from his stolen cattle more clearly now. The bandits were still moving south, but they had slowed their pace, probably to rest the cattle during the hottest part of the day. We're gaining on them, Jake observed. Ayanna nodded. But now comes the hard part, getting the cattle back from armed men. Jake had been so focused on crossing the dangerous valley that he hadn't given much thought to what would happen when they actually caught up with the thieves. 4 armed bandits would be more than a match for one cowboy and an Apache woman, no matter how skilled she was with knives. How many bullets do you have? Ayanna asked. Jake checked his rifle and the spare ammunition in his belt. About 30 rounds. Why? Because we cannot fight 4 men with guns and win. We must be smarter. Ayanna pointed toward a narrow canyon that cut across the path the cattle were taking. They will have to go through Devil's Canyon to reach Mexico. That is where we stop them. Jake studied the canyon through his small telescope. It was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for cattle to pass through single file. The walls were steep and rocky, providing excellent cover for anyone who wanted to set up an ambush. You're talking about an ambush, Jake said. I am talking about getting your cattle back, Ayanna replied. Unless you have a better idea. Jake didn't have a better idea. Facing 4 armed bandits in open country would be suicide. But ambushing them in the canyon at least gave them a chance to even the odds. They reached the mouth of Devil's Canyon about an hour before the stolen cattle were expected to arrive. The canyon was even more impressive up close, with red rock walls that rose over 200 feet on both sides. The floor was strewn with boulders and debris that had fallen from above over the centuries. Perfect place for an ambush, Jake admitted. Ayanna was already studying the canyon walls, looking for the best positions. You take the east side, up on that ledge. She pointed to a natural shelf about 30 feet up the canyon wall. I will be on the west side behind those big rocks. Jake looked at the ledge she had indicated. It would give him an excellent view of the entire canyon floor, and there was good cover behind some fallen rocks. What's the plan? When the cattle enter the canyon, the bandits will spread out to keep them moving. That is when they are most vulnerable. Ayanna began checking her weapons. You take the 2 riders at the back. I will handle the ones in front. You have a rifle? Jake asked. Ayanna smiled and pulled something from her pack that made Jake's eyes widen. It was a Winchester repeating rifle, well-maintained and obviously expensive. My brother took this from a cavalry soldier who tried to cheat our people in a horse trade. Jake was impressed. Winchester rifles were the finest weapons available, accurate and reliable. In the hands of someone who knew how to use it, a Winchester could be deadly at long range. Can you shoot? Jake asked. Instead of answering, Ayanna pointed to a small cactus growing on the opposite canyon wall, at least 150 yards away. She raised the rifle, took quick aim, and fired. The cactus exploded in a shower of pulp and spines. I can shoot, she said simply. They took their positions and settled in to wait. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. Jake found himself thinking about how strange his day had been. This morning, he had been tracking cattle thieves alone. Now he was preparing for a gun battle alongside an Apache woman who had already saved his life once. The sound of cattle reached them before the animals came into view. The lowing of tired steers, the crack of whips, and the shouts of men driving them forward echoed off the canyon walls. Jake checked his rifle one more time and made sure he had a clear line of fire to the canyon floor below. The first cattle appeared at the mouth of the canyon, moving slowly and reluctantly into the narrow passage. Jake counted the steers as they passed below him. 38 head, close to the 40 that had been stolen from the Double R Ranch. 2 were probably lost along the way, or maybe the bandits had butchered them for food. Behind the cattle came the bandits, 4 men on horseback, just as Ayanna had said. They were spread out along the sides of the herd, using whips and shouts to keep the reluctant cattle moving through the narrow canyon. The bandits looked exactly like what they were, rough men who made their living by theft and violence. They wore sombreros and serapes, and Jake could see pistols and rifles on their saddles. These were not desperate farmers driven to crime by hunger. These were professional outlaws. Jake waited until all 4 bandits were inside the canyon, then looked across at Ayanna's position. She raised her hand to signal that she was ready. Jake took careful aim at the rearmost bandit and waited for her signal to fire. The signal came as a rifle shot that echoed like thunder between the canyon walls. Ayanna's bullet knocked the lead bandit from his saddle, and Jake's shot dropped the man at the back of the herd almost simultaneously. The remaining 2 bandits reacted quickly, spurring their horses toward the canyon walls and drawing their weapons. But Jake and Ayanna had chosen their positions well. The bandits were trapped in the bottom of the canyon with nowhere to take cover. "Surrender!" Jake shouted down at them. "You're surrounded!" One of the remaining bandits, a man with a thick black beard, shouted something in Spanish and began firing wildly with his pistol. His bullets sparked off the rocks near Jake's position, but the range was too great for accurate pistol fire. Ayanna's Winchester cracked again, and the bearded bandit tumbled from his horse. That left only one man, a younger Mexican who looked terrified. His horse was dancing nervously beneath him, and Jake could see that the man was trying to decide whether to fight or run. "Drop your weapons," Jake called out. "It's over." The young bandit looked around desperately, then threw his pistol onto the ground and raised his hands. "No more shooting! I surrender!" Jake and Ayanna climbed down from their positions, keeping their rifles trained on the surviving bandit. 2 of the men they had shot were clearly dead, but the bearded one was still moving weakly. Ayanna knelt beside him and checked his wound. "He will live if he gets help soon," she reported. The young bandit was babbling in Spanish, obviously frightened and begging for mercy. Jake didn't speak Spanish well, but he caught enough words to understand that the man was promising to tell them everything about the cattle rustling operation. "What's he saying?" Jake asked. Ayanna listened for a moment, then translated. "He says there are more men coming. A larger group, maybe 20 riders. They plan to steal many cattle and sell them in Mexico." This was the worst news Jake could have imagined. A gang of 20 armed bandits could overwhelm the scattered ranches in the area before help could arrive from the army or the territorial authorities. "When?" Jake demanded. Ayanna spoke to the bandit in Spanish, then turned back to Jake with a grim expression. "Tomorrow night. They plan to hit 3 ranches at once." Jake felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. Tomorrow night didn't give him enough time to get back to town and organize a proper defense, and even if he could get word to the other ranchers, 20 armed bandits would be too many for the local men to handle. "We have to warn people," Jake said. "First, we must get these cattle back to safety," Ayanna pointed out, "and decide what to do with him." She nodded toward the wounded bandit. Jake looked at the injured man who was conscious but losing blood steadily. They couldn't just leave him here to die, but they also couldn't afford to be slowed down by a wounded prisoner. "Can you make it to the border on your own?" Jake asked the man in his limited Spanish. The wounded bandit nodded weakly. "Sí, señor. I go home." No more trouble. It wasn't a perfect solution, but Jake didn't see any alternative. They gave the man water and some basic first aid, then helped him onto his horse. The bandit rode slowly toward the south, probably heading for Mexico and safety. That left Jake and Ayanna with nearly 40 head of stolen cattle and no easy way to get them back to the Double R ranch. The cattle were tired and scattered, and it would take hours to gather them properly, but leaving them in the canyon wasn't an option either. "How far to your ranch?" Ayanna asked. 2 days hard driving," Jake replied. "But I don't think we can make it that fast with tired cattle and no other riders to help." "Then we must find another way," Ayanna said. She was studying the canyon walls, looking for something. "There is an old Apache trail that leads to a hidden valley, good grass and water. The cattle could rest there while we go for help." Jake was amazed by how much this woman knew about the country. Every time he thought they were facing an impossible situation, she came up with a solution he never would have considered. "How far is this valley?" he asked. "Half a day's drive, but the trail is difficult. We would have to take the cattle up through the rocks." Ayanna pointed to what looked like an impossible path winding up the steep canyon wall. Jake studied the rocky trail through his telescope. It was narrow and steep, but he could see that it was wide enough for cattle if they were driven carefully. And getting the stolen herd to a safe hiding place would give him time to plan how to deal with the larger bandit gang that was coming. "Let's do it," Jake decided. They spent the next several hours gathering the scattered cattle and driving them toward the hidden trail. The work was exhausting in the desert heat, and both Jake and Ayanna were covered with dust and sweat by the time they got the herd moving in the right direction. The trail up the canyon wall was even more difficult than it had looked. The cattle balked at the steep, narrow path, and several times Jake thought they would lose animals over the edge. But Ayanna seemed to have an instinctive understanding of how to move cattle through difficult terrain. She knew when to push and when to let them rest, when to make noise to keep them moving, and when to stay quiet so they wouldn't panic. As the sun began to set, they finally reached the hidden valley that Ayanna had promised. It was a beautiful place, completely enclosed by high rock walls, with a small spring feeding a clear stream and plenty of grass for the cattle to graze. "This is perfect," Jake said, looking around the valley. "The cattle will be safe here." "My people have used this place for many years," Ayanna explained. "It is hidden from anyone who does not know the way." They made camp near the spring, and for the first time all day, Jake allowed himself to relax slightly. The stolen cattle were safe. They had proof that Mexican bandits were responsible for the theft, and they had learned about the larger criminal operation that was being planned. But as Jake sat by their small campfire, eating jerky and hardtack, he realized that their biggest challenges still lay ahead. They had to get word to the scattered ranchers about the coming attack, organize some kind of defense against 20 armed bandits, and do it all before tomorrow night. "We should leave at first light," Jake said. "It's going to take all day to warn everyone." Ayanna nodded, but Jake could see that something was troubling her. "What is it?" he asked. "The young bandit, the one who surrendered. I do not think he was telling the truth about everything." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" He was too frightened, too eager to talk. Men like that usually try to save themselves by telling lies that make them seem important. Ayanna stared into the fire. "I think the attack may come sooner than tomorrow night." As if to confirm her fears, the distant sound of gunshots echoed across the desert, coming from the direction of the nearest ranch. Someone was under attack right now. Jake jumped to his feet and grabbed his rifle. "We're too late," he said grimly. "No," Ayanna said, also standing. "We are exactly where we need to be. This valley has another secret, one that might save many lives." She led Jake to the far end of the valley where the rock walls seemed to come together in a solid barrier. But as they got closer, Jake could see that there was actually a narrow opening, hidden behind fallen rocks and desert brush. This passage leads to the top of Mesa Grande, Ayanna explained. From there, you can see for 50 miles in every direction, and there is something else up there that might help us. Jake didn't know what she meant, but he trusted her judgment. This Apache woman had already saved his life once and shown him solutions to problems he couldn't have solved on his own. As they began climbing the hidden passage toward the mesa top, Jake wondered what other surprises this remarkable woman had in store, and in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that their real adventure was just beginning. The climb to the top of Mesa Grande took nearly an hour in the darkness. Jake followed Ayanna up the narrow, winding path, trusting her to find the way, even though he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The sound of distant gunfire continued sporadically, telling them that the attack on the nearby ranch was still ongoing. When they finally reached the mesa top, Jake understood why Ayanna had brought him here. The flat summit stretched for several acres and provided a commanding view of the entire region. Even in the moonlight, Jake could see the distant glow of fires from at least 3 different locations. The bandits hit multiple ranches at once, just like the prisoner said they would, Jake observed grimly. But look there. Ayanna pointed toward the center of the mesa. Jake turned and saw something that made his jaw drop. Rising from the rocky surface of the mesa was a tall wooden tower, at least 50 feet high. At the top of the tower, he could make out the shape of a large mirror or reflective surface. "What is that thing?" Jake asked. "Signal mirror," Ayanna explained. "My people built it 5 years ago to watch for army patrols and warn other tribes. The mirror can send light signals that can be seen for many miles." Jake immediately understood the potential of such a device. "We can warn people about the attacks." "Better than that," Ayanna said, climbing toward the tower. "We can call for help." As they reached the base of the tower, Ayanna began explaining how the signal system worked. The large mirror at the top could be adjusted to catch moonlight or sunlight and reflect it in specific directions. Different combinations of flashes had different meanings, creating a code that could send complex messages across vast distances. "Who will see the signals?" Jake asked as they climbed the wooden ladder attached to the tower. "Other Apache scouts on distant mountains, but also Army lookouts at Fort Bowie, and maybe some ranchers who know the code." Ayanna reached the top of the tower and began adjusting the large mirror. "My brother taught this system to some white men who helped our people during the drought last year." Jake helped Ayanna position the mirror to catch the bright moonlight. The reflective surface was larger than he had expected, nearly 4 feet across, and polished to a brilliant shine. When properly angled, it could probably be seen from 50 miles away or more. "What message should we send?" Jake asked. Ayanna thought for a moment, then began working the mirror in a series of precise flashes. "Bandits attacking ranches. Send help immediately. Many riders needed." The signal flashes lit up the night like artificial lightning. Jake counted the individual flashes and pauses, trying to memorize the pattern in case he ever needed to use such a system himself. Ayanna repeated the message 3 times, sending it in different directions to increase the chances of it being seen. "Now we wait," she said, climbing down from the mirror platform. "How long?" Jake asked. "If anyone saw the signal, help could come by morning. The Army has fast riders, and some ranchers keep horses ready for emergencies." Ayanna looked out over the valley where fires still burned in the distance. "But we cannot wait and do nothing. People are dying down there." Jake knew she was right. Even if help was coming, it might not arrive in time to save the people currently under attack, and there was no guarantee that anyone had seen their signal. "What can 2 people do against 20 bandits?" Jake asked. Ayanna smiled, and in the moonlight, her expression reminded Jake of a hunting cat. "Create confusion. Make them think they are facing more enemies than they really are. Give the ranchers time to organize a defense." She outlined her plan as they made their way back down the mesa. The bandit gang had split into smaller groups to hit multiple ranches simultaneously. This was smart strategy for maximum impact, but it also meant that each group was smaller and more vulnerable. "We hit them one group at a time," Ayanna explained. "Hit fast, make noise, then disappear before they can organize a response. Make them think they are being attacked by a large force." "Guerrilla warfare," Jake said, recognizing the tactics. "My people have been fighting this way for generations," Ayanna confirmed. "We cannot match the army's numbers or weapons, but we can choose when and where to fight." Their first target was the closest ranch, about 3 miles from Mesa Grande. As they approached on foot, leaving Thunder safely hidden in the valley, they could see that the attack was still in progress. The ranch house was surrounded by 4 riders who were keeping the family pinned down inside while they systematically looted the outbuildings. "4 men," Jake whispered as they crouched behind a low hill overlooking the ranch. "We're outnumbered 2 to 1. "Not if we do this right," Ayanna replied. She was checking her weapons and making final preparations. "You circle around to the barn. When you hear my signal, start shooting and making as much noise as possible. Shout like you're commanding a large group of men." Jake understood the plan. If they could make the bandits think they were facing a superior force, the outlaws might retreat rather than stand and fight. It was risky, but it was better than doing nothing while innocent people were terrorized. Jake worked his way around to the position Ayanna had indicated, staying low and using the darkness for cover. The bandits were focused on the ranch house and hadn't posted any guards on the perimeter. This overconfidence would be their downfall. When he was in position behind the barn, Jake waited for Ayanna's signal. It came as a wild Apache war cry that echoed across the ranch yard like the voice of an angry spirit. Immediately, Jake began firing his rifle and shouting commands to imaginary soldiers. "Move up on the left flank," he yelled. "Charlie Company, take the corral. Don't let any of them escape." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The 4 bandits, who had been casually looting the ranch, suddenly found themselves under fire from multiple directions. Ayanna's rifle cracked repeatedly from the hillside, while Jake's shots came from behind the barn. In the confusion, it was impossible for the bandits to tell how many attackers they faced. 2 of the bandits panicked immediately, spurring their horses toward the open range without even trying to fight back. A 3rd bandit tried to return fire, but Ayanna's bullet knocked him from his saddle. The 4th man, apparently the leader of this group, attempted to rally his remaining men, but when he realized he was alone, he too fled into the darkness. The entire fight lasted less than 5 minutes. When the shooting stopped, Jake could hear voices from inside the ranch house, the family calling out to ask if it was safe to come out. "It's safe," Jake called back. "The bandits are gone." The ranch family emerged cautiously from their fortified house. There were 5 of them, parents and 3 children, all frightened but unharmed. The father, a weathered man named Tom Wilson, recognized Jake from previous cattle drives. "Jake Morrison, what are you doing here?" Wilson asked, still gripping a shotgun. "Long story," Jake replied, "but there's a gang of Mexican bandits hitting ranches all over this area tonight. You folks need to get to town or to one of the larger ranches where you can defend yourselves." "We heard shooting from the direction of the Murphy place," Mrs. Wilson said, pointing east. "Do you think they're in trouble too?" "Probably," Jake said grimly. "How many people at the Murphy ranch?" "Just old Murphy and his grandson," Wilson replied. "They won't be able to hold off a gang of bandits." Jake looked at Ayanna, who had approached while he was talking to the family. Her expression told him what he already knew. They had to help the Murphy ranch, even though it meant facing more dangers. "Can you folks make it to town on your own?" Jake asked the Wilsons. "We'll manage," Tom Wilson replied. "But what about you? 2 people can't take on an entire gang of outlaws." "We're not taking them on directly," Ayanna said quietly. "We're just trying to delay them until help arrives." The Wilson family quickly gathered essential belongings and hitched their horses to a wagon. As they prepared to leave for town, Mrs. Wilson pressed a bundle of food and medical supplies into Ayanna's hands. "For helping us," she said gratefully, "and be careful. Those men looked like killers." Jake and Ayanna watched the Wilson family disappear into the darkness, then turned toward the Murphy ranch. They had been lucky with their first encounter, but Jake wondered if their luck would hold. The Murphy place was different from the Wilson ranch. Where the Wilsons had a solid house and good defensive positions, the Murphy ranch was just a small cabin and a few outbuildings scattered across an open valley. There was little cover for defenders, and Jake could see immediately that the situation here was more desperate. 3 bandits had the cabin surrounded, and they were taking turns firing into the building to keep the occupants pinned down. One outbuilding was already on fire, and Jake could see one of the bandits preparing to torch the cabin itself. "We're too late," Jake said, watching the scene unfold. "No," Ayanna replied, studying the terrain around the ranch. "Look at how they're positioned. They think they have everything under control. That makes them careless." She was right. The 3 bandits were spread out around the cabin, but they weren't watching their backs. They were so focused on their victims that they had forgotten to post guards or watch for approaching enemies. "Same strategy as before?" Jake asked. "With one change," Ayanna said. "This time we don't just scare them away. We capture one of them alive. We need information about where the rest of the gang is going next." This was a more dangerous plan, but Jake could see the wisdom in it. If they could learn the bandits' next target, they might be able to prevent another attack entirely. They split up again, with Jake circling to the north and Ayanna approaching from the south. The plan was to eliminate 2 of the bandits quickly, then surround and capture the 3rd one before he could escape or harm the people in the cabin. Jake reached his position just as one of the bandits threw a torch toward the cabin roof. The dry wooden shingles caught fire immediately, and Jake could hear screaming from inside the building. There was no more time for careful planning. Jake's first shot dropped the bandit with the torch. His second shot went toward the bandit on the far side of the cabin, but the man dove behind a water trough before the bullet could find its mark. That left one bandit unaccounted for, somewhere in the shadows near the barn. Ayanna's rifle spoke from the darkness, and Jake saw the muzzle flash from her position. A man screamed in pain, but Jake couldn't tell if the shot had been fatal or just wounding. Then he heard the rapid sound of hoofbeats as someone tried to escape on horseback. "Stop him!" Ayanna called out. Jake saw a rider silhouetted against the burning cabin and fired quickly. The shot went high, but it spooked the horse, which reared and threw its rider to the ground. The bandit rolled behind a pile of firewood and began shooting wildly with his pistol. "Surrender!" Jake shouted. "You're surrounded!" The bandit's only response was more gunfire, but his position behind the woodpile was not good cover, and he was running out of ammunition. After a few more shots, Jake heard the distinctive click of an empty gun. "I'm coming out!" the bandit called in heavily accented English. "Don't shoot!" A young Mexican man emerged from behind the woodpile with his hands raised. He was wounded in the shoulder, blood staining his white shirt, but he was still on his feet. Jake kept his rifle trained on the man while Ayanna checked on the other bandits. "Both dead," she reported, rejoining Jake and their prisoner. While they secured the bandit, old Murphy and his teenage grandson emerged from the burning cabin. The roof was fully engulfed now, but the walls were still standing. Murphy was a tough old bird, probably in his 70s, but his eyes were bright and alert. "Much obliged for the help," Murphy said, surveying the dead bandits. "Thought we were goners for sure." "Are you folks hurt?" Jake asked. "Nothing serious," Murphy replied. "But we lost most everything in the fire." He looked at the burning cabin with resignation. "Guess I'm too old to start over again." "Don't give up yet," Ayanna said. "This is not over. There are still more bandits out there." She turned to their prisoner and began questioning him in Spanish. The young bandit was clearly in pain from his wound, and he seemed eager to cooperate in exchange for medical attention. After a few minutes of conversation, Ayanna translated for Jake. "The main group is hitting the largest ranch in the area," she said. "The Double Diamond spread. They plan to steal all the horses and cattle they can carry, then head for Mexico." Jake knew the Double Diamond Ranch. It was owned by a man named Harrison, who had built it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. But it was also isolated, at least 10 miles from the nearest neighbor. "How many men?" Jake asked. Ayanna questioned the prisoner again, then replied grimly. 12 riders hit the Double Diamond, plus whatever men survived the attacks on the other ranches." Jake felt his heart sink. Even if they could reach the Double Diamond in time, 2 people couldn't possibly stop a dozen armed bandits, and the Harrison family probably didn't even know they were about to be attacked. "How long ago did they leave for the Harrison place?" Jake asked. 2 hours, Ayanna translated. "Maybe longer." That meant the attack on the Double Diamond was probably already underway, and unlike the smaller ranches they had helped defend, the Harrison spread had valuable livestock that would take time to gather and steal. The bandits might still be there when Jake and Ayanna arrived. "We have to try," Jake said, even though he knew the odds were against them. "Yes," Ayanna agreed, "but first we get help." She looked up at the sky, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to show on the eastern horizon. Time to send another signal. They left the wounded bandit in the care of old Murphy and his grandson, along with instructions to tie the man up securely and deliver him to the sheriff when help arrived. Then they made their way back to Mesa Grande as quickly as possible. The climb to the signal tower seemed to take forever, even though they were moving as fast as they could in the pre-dawn darkness. By the time they reached the mirror platform, the eastern sky was bright enough to provide the sunlight they needed for a strong signal. "What's the message this time?" Jake asked as Ayanna adjusted the mirror. "Emergency at Double Diamond Ranch. Large bandit force. Need immediate help." She began working the mirror in the precise pattern that would carry their desperate message across the desert. As the signal flashes lit up the morning sky, Jake found himself hoping that someone somewhere was watching and would understand the urgency of their situation. The Harrison family was counting on help that might never come. But when Ayanna finished sending the message, something unexpected happened. From a distant mountain peak to the north, an answering signal began flashing. Someone had received their message and was responding. "What are they saying?" Jake asked excitedly. Ayanna watched the distant flashes carefully, translating the coded message. "Cavalry patrol from Fort Bowie, 30 minutes away. Will investigate Double Diamond Ranch." Jake felt a surge of hope. A cavalry patrol would have the numbers and firepower needed to deal with the bandit gang. If they could reach the Harrison Ranch in time, the outlaws would find themselves facing professional soldiers instead of helpless ranchers. "Is 30 minutes soon enough?" Jake asked. "We make sure it is," Ayanna replied grimly. They climbed down from the tower and retrieved Thunder from the hidden valley where they had left him. The stolen cattle were still grazing peacefully in the secluded valley, apparently unaware of the violence that had been taking place in the world outside their rocky sanctuary. The ride to the Double Diamond Ranch took 20 minutes of hard galloping across rough country. Thunder was tired from the previous day's adventures, but the faithful horse gave everything he had when Jake asked for speed. Ayanna ran alongside them with the tireless endurance that seemed to be a gift of her people. As they approached the Harrison Ranch, Jake could see that they were almost too late. The main house was surrounded by bandits, and several outbuildings were on fire. The outlaws had gathered nearly 100 head of horses and cattle in a makeshift corral, obviously preparing for a quick departure to Mexico. "How do we delay them?" Jake asked. Ayanna pointed toward the temporary corral where the stolen livestock were being held. "Scatter the animals. Without horses and cattle, the bandits have no reason to stay and fight." It was a brilliant strategy. If they could stampede the animals, the bandits would either have to spend precious time rounding them up again or give up their loot entirely. Either way, it would buy time for the cavalry to arrive. Jake and Ayanna positioned themselves on opposite sides of the corral. At Ayanna's signal, they both began shooting into the air and making as much noise as possible. The effect on the penned animals was immediate and dramatic. The horses and cattle, already nervous from the sounds of gunfire and shouting, bolted in all directions when the shooting started. In seconds, the carefully gathered herd was scattered across the landscape, with individual animals running toward every point of the compass. The bandits reacted with fury and confusion. Some tried to chase the fleeing animals, while others turned their attention toward finding and eliminating the people who had ruined their carefully planned raid. "There!" one of the bandits shouted in Spanish, pointing toward Jake's position. "Kill them!" 6 or 7 riders spurred their horses toward the rocks where Jake was hidden. But before they could reach him, the sound that Jake had been praying for echoed across the desert, the bugle call of approaching cavalry. Over a ridge to the north appeared the most beautiful sight Jake had ever seen, a full troop of U.S. cavalry riding at full gallop with their sabers drawn and guidon streaming in the wind. The soldiers had obviously received Ayanna's signal and understood the urgency of the situation. The bandit leader, a man with silver conchos on his hat and crossed bandoliers across his chest, immediately grasped the hopelessness of his situation. Facing a full cavalry troop in open country was suicide for outlaws armed only with pistols and rifles. "Retreat!" he shouted to his men. "Every man for himself!" The bandits scattered like leaves in a windstorm, each man racing for the border and safety in Mexico. The cavalry troops split into smaller units to pursue different groups of fleeing outlaws, and the desert erupted with the sounds of pursuit and capture. Jake and Ayanna emerged from their hiding places to find that the immediate danger was over. The Harrison family was safe, though shaken by their ordeal. Most of their livestock had been recovered, and the cavalry was rounding up the bandits who hadn't been fast enough to escape. The cavalry captain, a grizzled veteran named Roberts, rode up to where Jake and Ayanna were standing. "You folks the ones who sent the signal from Mesa Grande?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Jake replied. "Just in time, looks like." Captain Roberts looked at Ayanna with surprise and respect. "Ma'am, I don't know how you learned our signal codes, but your message probably saved a lot of lives today." "My people and your people should help each other when there is danger," Ayanna replied simply. The captain nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe you're right about that." As the day progressed, the full scope of the bandit raid became clear. The gang had hit 6 different ranches, but thanks to Jake and Ayanna's warnings and interventions, the damage had been minimized. Only one family had suffered serious losses, and no one had been killed. The stolen cattle from the Double R Ranch were recovered from the hidden valley, and Jake was able to return them to their rightful owners. The evidence they had gathered proving Mexican bandits were responsible cleared the local Apache of any blame for the cattle thefts. But perhaps most importantly, the cooperation between Jake, Ayanna, and the cavalry had shown that white settlers, Apache, and the U.S. Army could work together when they faced a common threat. As evening approached, Jake found himself back at the hidden valley with Ayanna, preparing for what would probably be their final night together. Tomorrow, she would return to her people, and he would go back to his life as a cowboy. Their strange partnership would become just a memory. "I want to thank you," Jake said as they sat by a small fire, "for everything. Saving my life, helping me get the cattle back, teaching me things about this country I never knew." "You helped my people too," Ayanna replied. "Now when cattle are stolen, maybe white men will remember that Apache are not always to blame." "What will you do now?" Jake asked. "Return to my father. Tell him what happened here." Ayanna stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. "Maybe convince him that some white men can be trusted." "And what will I do?" Jake wondered aloud. Keep tracking stolen cattle, I think, Ayanna said with a slight smile. It is what you do best. Jake laughed, realizing she was probably right. He had never been good at settling down or taking easy jobs. The open range and the challenge of tracking thieves across dangerous country were in his blood. Will I see you again? He asked. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. This is big country, she said finally, but not so big that two people cannot find each other if they try. The next morning, they parted ways at the mouth of Devil's Canyon. Jake rode north toward the Double R Ranch with his recovered cattle, while Ayanna headed south toward Apache territory. Neither of them looked back, but both carried memories that would last a lifetime. Years later, when Jake had become a legendary figure among the cowboys and ranchers of the territory, people would sometimes ask him about the day he and an Apache woman had defeated an entire gang of bandits. Jake would always tell the story, but he would end it the same way every time. That Apache woman, he would say, taught me that courage doesn't care about the color of your skin or the language you speak. Sometimes the person who saves your life is the last person you'd expect, and sometimes the best partner you'll ever have is someone the world tells you to fear. And on quiet nights, when the desert wind carried strange sounds across the vast landscape, Jake would sometimes hear what sounded like an Apache war cry echoing from the direction of Mesa Grande. Whether it was really Ayanna or just his imagination, he was never quite sure. But he always hoped it was real.